Let's start with a truth that few people know about medieval castles. They were incredibly cold. Not the grab a blanket kind of cold, but the kind of cold that makes your breath visible in the air indoors. The stone walls, which were designed to protect the inhabitants from invasions, didn't care at all about thermal comfort. In fact, medieval castles were built to withstand sieges, not to keep their residents warm. So, imagine this. You're inside one of those giant stone fortresses, with small windows, no glass to protect against the cold wind, and no central heating or efficient fireplaces to warm the place up. As the sun sets and the wind picks up, the cold sneaks in through cracks in the thick walls, underneath the heavy wooden doors, and through the gaps in the windows. No matter how much you curl up or try to bundle up, the cold seems to penetrate every corner of the castle. While the nobles settled in grand and imposing halls, the heat from the fires struggled to warm the massive empty spaces around them. And for the peasants and servants who slept in even colder and poorly heated rooms, things weren't much better. The castle, then, was a place where the cold wasn't just part of the landscape, it shaped the lives of those who lived there, making the simple task of sleeping through the night a true battle for survival. Now, let's talk about the main culprit, the stone walls. Castles were made of them, and for good reason. The stone was durable, fireproof, and excellent against arrows and battering rams. But stone, while great for defending against invasions, did nothing when it came to holding in warmth. On the contrary, it was a true sponge for cold. Stone absorbs the cold from the outside, and once it cools down, it holds that temperature for hours, sometimes even days, depending on the weather. This meant that as night fell, the cold stone walls would begin radiating that chill into the rooms, freezing the space as if you were inside a cold cave. And this wasn't just a minor discomfort. The stone walls, which could be up to 10 feet thick, turned rooms into giant ice blocks. Even if you lit a fire to try to warm up, the heat from the flames wasn't enough to overcome the massive cold stone. Once the flames died down, the heat disappeared, and the cold came back with full force. If the night was especially cold, what you'd have in the morning was the same ice as before. So no matter how hard you tried, the cold just wouldn't relent. Castles then were places where the surrounding environment was relentless, challenging even the most desperate attempts to heat the space. Sleeping in a medieval castle was a true test of endurance. Picture the scene. You lie down on a simple bed, with the biting cold seeping through every crack in the walls. The grand halls, often used for banquets and gatherings, were turned into makeshift dormitories at night. There was no insulation, no warm walls to protect you from the icy wind that swept through the castle. For those sleeping on the upper floors, the situation was even worse. Up there, in the towers, the wind sliced through like knives, and the small windows, with no glass, only made the problem worse. The idea of sleeping warm was practically a fantasy. The nobles, who had more resources, used what they could to create some comfort. High beds with heavy curtains, and straw or feather mattresses. But even then they couldn't escape the reality the cold was always lurking, ready to invade. As for the servants, who slept in far more precarious conditions, they often found themselves in rooms without any heating, sometimes in hallways or even on the cold stone floor, where the cold was unrelenting. Sleeping in a medieval castle wasn't a time of rest, it was a battle to survive the cold that infiltrated every minute. When we think of castles, we probably imagine grand fireplaces, festive fires, and a sense of coziness. The reality, however, was quite different. Medieval castles weren't designed to keep their inhabitants warm, they were built to withstand sieges and invasions. The architecture of castles reflected this priority. Thick stone walls, small windows to prevent enemies from having a clear view of the interior, and massive rooms with soaring ceilings. Instead of providing warmth, these features only amplified the cold problem. Without any central heating structure or efficient ventilation systems, the heat produced by the few fires that existed could hardly warm a fraction of the large spaces that castles represented. Even the grand fireplaces, a luxury only present in the nobles' halls, were ineffective. They warmed only the immediate area around them, leaving the rest of the room as cold as the air outside. Instead of a warm refuge, the castle was a place where its inhabitants had to adapt, living in the cold to survive. The battle against the cold in medieval fortresses was far from easy, and fires were the only line of defense for many. However, these fires were incredibly inefficient. Let's be honest, they were big and flashy, but their ability to warm up the space was quite limited. Picture a massive fireplace in a gigantic hall with 30-foot-high ceilings and stone walls. The fire could warm up a very small area around the flames, but the rest of the room remained cold. Even if you were sitting right by the fire, you could feel the difference between the direct warmth and the cutting chill of the room. Moreover, before the 12th century, castles didn't have proper chimneys. The smoke from the fireplace simply accumulated in the air, with no place to go. The smoke would invade the rooms, making the environment unbearable. The few who were lucky enough to be near a fireplace were suffocated by the smell of smoke and the particles that floated in the air. The fresh air of the night wasn't the only enemy to face. The smoke, which should have been the reflection of a cozy fire, only made the situation worse. In other words, medieval castles were places where the warmth never lasted long enough. and the smoke became almost as bothersome as the cold itself. When it came to finding a solution to the cold, medieval beds became a true refuge. But don't be fooled. These beds weren't exactly like the ones we have today. They were simple, but in reality, they were one of the greatest allies against the ice that invaded the castles. Medieval beds were high, elevated off the ground to avoid the biting winds that swept across the cold stone floors. This allowed the heavy layers of blankets and thick fabric curtains to do their job of keeping warmth inside. Nobles, with greater access to resources, had beds with heavy wool or velvet curtains, creating a kind of heat capsule. When the curtains were drawn, the warmth from the body concentrated there, creating a small warm refuge amidst the relentless cold of the rest of the room. Even the mattress, made of straw or feathers, wasn't perfect, but it helped to isolate the bed from the freezing floor. For those with more resources, comfort was ensured with extra layers of animal skins, like sheep or fox pelts. But for many, the solution was something much simpler: sharing the bed. Most of the time, noble families would sleep together in large beds, with several people joining forces to share the warmth, especially on the harshest nights. The closeness of human bodies helped to maintain the heat, creating a sense of security in the midst of the immense cold. So, even in the most elaborate beds, comfort was shared, and the act of sleeping became more about survival than pleasure. While the nobles enjoyed beds with heavy curtains and more comfortable mattresses, the real battle against the cold was fought by the servants, whose work often went unnoticed, but was essential for everyone's survival in the castle. For the servants, winter was especially brutal. They were responsible for ensuring the fire and the fireplaces never went out, and for preparing the nobles' beds with as much care as possible. Their routine began long before nightfall. First, they would start the fires in the hearths and in small heaters known as braziers. They carried embers, small pieces of burning coal or charcoal, from one room to another, preparing the chambers for the night. But the work didn't stop there. Servants also heated stones, warming them in the flames to place them under the mattresses. These stones helped to provide a little warmth when the nobles climbed into bed, as the environment around them remained icy. And it wasn't just the fire that the servants controlled. They were also responsible for ensuring the blankets were layered enough to protect the nobles from the cold of the night. They would place warm clothing on the bed, wrap the nobles in woolen blankets, and even heat metal bottles with hot water, which were slipped under the covers like medieval hot water bottles. The servants stayed up all night, watching the flames, ready to refill the brazier or the hearth with more wood, to make sure the fire didn't go out during the night. Their work didn't end once the nobles fell asleep. They remained vigilant throughout the night, facing the cold to ensure the warmth of their masters. As medieval castles struggled to find solutions for the cold, a crucial invention emerged: the copper heater. While nobles already used braziers, which were simple metal containers filled with coals or embers, technology was improved with the use of copper. Copper, a highly heat-conductive material, became a valuable ally in the battle against the cold. Copper heaters were essentially small metal containers with fire embers inside, which servants would place under the beds or even at the feet of the nobles to warm the bed before they slept. While these copper heaters were not a perfect solution, they helped create localized, temporary warmth, offering some relief on the coldest nights. Additionally, heated stones continued to be a widely used technique. Servants would heat stones in the fires and wrap them in cloth to place under the mattresses or around the feet of the nobles. The idea was simple but effective. The stones would store heat and release it slowly, providing some comfort while the cold outside remained relentless. These heated stones were, in fact, one of the simplest and most practical ways to generate warmth, and for a long time they were used alongside copper heaters to maximize warmth in the beds. For the servants and peasants, these inventions represented a significant advance. They didn't have the same resources or luxury as the nobles, but these makeshift heating methods provided at least some protection against the intense cold, though still far from modern comfort. The use of copper and heated stones became an essential part of adapting to life in the harsh conditions of medieval castles. When we talk about the people who truly survived the cold in medieval fortresses, the answer isn't always straightforward. It wasn't just about dealing with discomfort, it was about how these people faced the battle against the cold, which often resulted in unexpected deaths. Nobles, despite their warmer beds and the help of their servants, were not immune to the effects of the cold. Illnesses and complications from freezing were common. Those living in the top of the towers, where the wind was strongest, suffered from the cold drafts that cut through their poorly insulated rooms. Even the nobles, who were more sheltered, constantly battled colds, fevers, and joint inflammations caused by prolonged exposure to the cold. On the other hand, the servants and peasants, who didn't have the same resources, were in an even worse situation. They were forced to sleep in unheated rooms, in hallways, or even in stables alongside animals, where the body heat of the animals helped alleviate the situation. However, this didn't prevent many from succumbing to the cold and dampness. Mortality rates among the lower classes of medieval society, especially during the colder months, were significantly higher. The lack of protection from the elements, poor diet, and unsanitary conditions made survival a difficult and often fatal task. Some extreme survival cases against the medieval cold were reported as acts of extraordinary endurance. Men and women who faced the cold without the help of warm blankets or elevated beds, or those who spent nights patrolling the castles, risking their lives in the intense cold. But in many cases, survival was a matter of luck. Castles, for the most part, were not equipped to face the rigors of winter, and the people who lived there had to adapt or pay the price for their vulnerability to the relentless cold. The battle against the cold in medieval fortresses teaches us something powerful about human nature: resilience. Although the conditions were extremely harsh, people didn't give up. They adapted, innovated, and did what they could to survive. Simple techniques like heating stones or using layers of wool are a testament to human creativity in extreme situations. Even in the darkest times, when dying from the cold was a very real possibility, people found ways to transform their uncomfortable surroundings into spaces of resistance. Today, while we stay warm with central heating systems and modern clothing, it might be hard to imagine what it was like to survive in such an inhospitable environment. But the lessons we can take from this period are profound. Deep down, we are all, in some way, like those medieval inhabitants, facing challenges and looking for solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. Survival isn't just about being physically warm, but about being able to endure, resist, and learn from adversity. Furthermore, the story of medieval castles and the fight against the cold also reminds us of the importance of solidarity. In those castles, warmth came from the people around us, whether through the servants who took care of the nobles' needs, or through families gathering around the bed to share warmth. Back then, just like today, true strength was in collaboration, the ability to come together in the face of difficulties and support one another in times of need. Ultimately, what truly defines human resilience is not comfort, but the ability to adapt and the strength to keep going, even in the harshest conditions. So, the next time you find yourself complaining about a harsh winter or lack of heating, remember that one day, someone spent the night in a stone castle, battling the relentless cold, and despite everything, they survived, not because they were warm, but because they were determined not to succumb.